In this lecture, we are going to look at MySQLi, which is an improved connector for MySQL that can be used within PHP. So MySQLi is called an improved connector for PHP. That's where I gather where the I comes from. In previous versions of the library, there were some limitations, and uh, the new library that we will look at here, that I will present, provides some other convenience functions for accessing the databases that you might have in MySQL on your servers. So there's basically two different variations or two variants of the MySQLi interface. There's a procedural interface and an object interface. Now if you look at the text that this material is based on, that's part of the assigned reading, it describes both. In this lecture I'm only going to be describing the object interface. Now there's also a chapter on object-oriented PHP, which is actually very simple, and I would have you take a look at the text for that in order to get caught up with it. But you'll see here in this set of lectures that the object interface uses pretty much the same types of functions that you would expect, or the methods that you would expect for object orientation. So there's constructors and you call methods and so forth. So anyway, let's move on and take a look at how to access a database using MySQLi in PHP. So first of all, there's some prerequisites. I am assuming here that you do have some knowledge of SQL, how to form queries and so forth. Also assuming that the servers have MySQL 5 or later installed with phpMyAdmin running. In later podcasts, we will look at setting up a database using phpMyAdmin. I am also assuming that MySQLi library is installed and that PHP 5 or later is being used. You can check all of this using PHP info by creating a short script of PHP and including this PHP info function within the script. So the first thing that you need to do with a PHP script when connecting to and accessing a database is to basically create the connection. And you do this by creating a function, creating a variable and calling the MySQLi constructor. So in the example that's shown here, we have a variable called MySQLi, and it's calling the constructor using the new operator. And there's 4 parameters listed here. I believe that the first one is the only one that's actually required, but you typically will include these 4. So you have the host name, and these do have to be coded. You'll have a username, a password, and the database that's being connected to. And I see that there's a small syntax error here, so I should fix that. Should be a quotation mark there. Okay, so what this function does is, or what this constructor does, is sets up a connector that is used to access the database. And what you will do is make query calls against this object. One thing to note here is that the password is contained in the source code in plain text, and so there are things that you'll have to do, and eventually I'll show you how to do this, to hide that information so that it isn't in an open directory and so that it can't be just readily seen within source code. So when accessing the database, there are basically 2 kinds of operations that I believe you need to do. The first one is to do a select statement, actual query of the database to get information from a table. So there's basically 3 steps to doing this. You build the query, you execute the query, and then you process the results. The second thing that you are typically going to want to do with the database is insert information into it. Insert or modify, update, and so forth, but typically insert is probably the best example of the kinds of thing that I want to show you, which is how to create a prepared statement. But if you think about the database, you want to do selection, and you want to do some sort of modification, whether it be insert, update, or delete. When you're doing insertions, what I'll just refer to as insertions, but if you're doing a prepared statement, you basically have 4 steps. You're going to initialize the statement. You're going to prepare the statement with some command. You'll bind parameters to it, and then you'll execute the command. So if you're going to do a simple select from the database, the first example of things I'm going to show you is the method that you want to use. And if you're going to do a modify, then you probably want to do a prepared statement. So when doing a select, you're basically following 3 steps. First is to build a query. So I'm showing you here, assuming that you've done your connection, as I showed a couple of slides ago. And then you're going to build your query, so it's basically just a string that says something like select ABC from table. And you can obviously do things like build this string using PHP concatenation and so forth to get the right values in for something like ABC or whatever it is that you're going to do for your select clause. Secondly, you're going to execute the query, and this is where that connection comes into play. What this is saying, and this is actually a dash, so it's my SQLi dash real query. Just the font isn't really good here. But anyway, what happens here is the query that you built earlier is being executed, and then the result after the execution is put into a result variable by making call to store result. And then finally what you want to do is process the results, and you'll do this in a loop of some fashion. And what you're going to do is use one of the fetch commands to actually grab the results. And so I'm going to show you a list of the functions that are available to you, and in following lectures we'll look at some examples where I actually build a query and we're actually reading values from a table. So here is the list of functions that you can actually use. They're all actually quite interesting ways of getting the data. The 2 that I really like are fetch associative and fetch object, partially because what they do is they allow you to use the names of the table rows, the table fields, as either indexes into an associative array or as fields within the return value for accessing specific parts of a row. Again, like I said, I will show you some examples of how to actually do all this, how to use the fetch objects or fetch associative array functions. And again, take a look at the text because there are some really good examples there on how to do a lot of this. The second kind of thing that we want to do with my SQLi is to use a prepared statement. So a prepared statement allows you to basically parameterize statements executed on the database. And this is especially useful if you're doing things in a sort of a repetitive manner. So you can create a query, put some basic stubs into the query, stubbed parameterized placeholders, and then insert into those positions specific values. So the way that these prepared statements work is that you initialize the statement, you prepare your query, you execute the query, and then eventually close it. So here's the basic structure for it. You will take that connector that you created, execute statement underscore init, and save that in statement. That'll create a statement object for you, and then you can prepare that query that you have created using the prepare function. Now if prepare ends up returning false, this will return a boolean. If it returns false, then you have probably a syntax error in your query. eventually then execute the query, and then you'll close the statement. So let's take a look at an example. Part of what you need to do is be able to bind your parameters, and this is part of what's being done here. So you prepare your query and then you execute it, and part of the execution of it is preparing and doing the bindings and then executing the query. So let's take a look at this example. So here is the command that I'm building, and I am basically saying I'm going to insert into a table into these particular fields and then some values, and then these question marks indicate placeholders for variable values that I will be putting into the table. So I first do the MySQLi statement init, and then actually I'm missing a piece here. Before I do that, let's make the modification to this because it is missing something. Then need to do a statement dash prepare command, prepare the command, and then you bind the parameters. So there are some variables that I would have in my program that I would use to bind to the specific parts of the command. So I would take the value of v1, put it into the first placeholder, v2 goes in the second placeholder, and v3 goes in the third placeholder. And then there are there's a string specification of the types of each of the variables. And so each of those t's can be one of either I, D, B, or S. So if I put an I there, then that would say that was an integer, and S would say it's a string, D would say it's a double, and so forth. So anyway, this is actually a fairly useful construction method that you can use, especially if you're doing things iteratively and you want to insert a number of things into a table. You can use these parameter bindings to get that done for you. So once you've actually prepared the statement and bound the parameters, you can then just execute it. So you simply use statement, right arrow, execute. That will execute the statement, and then will give you access, once it's completed, to a number of fields that allow you to check status and results and a number of other things. Again, these prepared statements are things that I would assume that you would do insertions or updates or deletions from the database. And again, you would use basically the other versions here of doing a select and performing a real query if you're doing some sort of search within the database. Anyway, in the upcoming 3 lectures, we'll look at setting up a database using phpMyAdmin. We will then create some PHP functions, PHP programs that will insert into the database, as well as select things from the database. Anyway, that concludes this lecture.